October 12, 1920. Kenilworth Park, Windsor, Ontario, Canada. 3-year-old Man O' War stood at the starting line for a match race against Sir Barton, the first Triple Crown winner in history, who'd swept the Kentucky Derby, Preakness Stakes, and Belmont Stakes the previous year. 30,000 Canadian fans packed the small track just across the Detroit River from Michigan, while thousands more stood outside the gates unable to get in. The race was billed as the match of the century, pitting America's greatest horse against Canada's champion in a winner-take-all showdown for supremacy. Man O' War entered as the overwhelming 1-20 favorite, despite carrying 120 pounds to Sir Barton's 126 pounds under weight-for-age conditions. The big chestnut colt, known as Big Red, had won his last 14 races in succession, 11 of them as a 3-year-old, destroying fields by margins that made other thoroughbreds look like ponies. He'd carried 138 pounds in races, conceding as much as 34 pounds to opponents, and still won by double-digit lengths. His jockey, Clarence Cummer, had instructions not to fully extend the horse, to win comfortably rather than set records that would increase future handicap weights even higher. Man O' War was so dominant that owners pulled horses from races when they learned he was entering. By October 1920, finding opponents willing to face him had become nearly impossible. Sir Barton, owned by Canadian horseman J.K.L. Ross, was a 4-year-old veteran of 28 career starts who'd won the 3 races that would later be known as the Triple Crown, though the term wouldn't be coined for another 10 years. He'd beaten good horses, set track records, earned respect throughout North America. But as the bell rang starting the match race, Sir Barton had no chance. Man O' War stalked him briefly, then passed him effortlessly on the backstretch and opened up a commanding lead. At the finish line, Man O' War was 7 lengths ahead, having broken the track record by 6 full seconds, while Cummer held him under restraint the entire race. It was Man O' War's 21st career start and 20th victory. The perfect ending to a racing career that had made him more famous than Babe Ruth, more celebrated than Jack Dempsey, the most revered athlete in America during the Roaring '20s. Within days, owner Samuel Riddle would announce Man O' War's retirement at age 3, ending one of the greatest racing careers in history. The horse, sold at auction for $5,000 in 1918, would be valued at over $1 million by retirement, having revolutionized thoroughbred racing and created a legacy that would influence every great horse that followed. This is the story of how a chestnut colt with bad temperament, inherited from his grandfather Hastings, became the most dominant racehorse of the 20th century, how he lost 1 race in his career under circumstances so controversial they're still debated 104 years later, how an owner's refusal to run him in the Kentucky Derby denied him the Triple Crown, and why Man O' War remains the standard by which all great horses are measured over a century after his final race. Man O' War was foaled March 29, 1917 at Nursery Stud near Lexington, Kentucky, bred by August Belmont, Jr., whose father had been honored through the naming of the Belmont Stakes in 1867. August Jr. was equally distinguished, serving as chairman of the Jockey Club from 1895 until his death in 1924. The breeding program at Nursery Stud was among America's finest, producing champion after champion through careful genetic planning. Man O' War's sire was Fair Play, a multiple stakes winner who'd finished second in the 1908 Belmont Stakes to the undefeated Colin. Fair Play was known for mean temperament and difficulty handling, traits inherited from his sire Hastings, the 1996 Belmont Stakes winner, notorious for biting and ramming other horses during races. Hastings was so violent and unpredictable that handlers feared working with him, but his racing ability was undeniable. To balance Fair Play's temperament problems, Belmont bred him to Mahuba, a lightly raced mare by Roxand, winner of the 1903 English Triple Crown. Mahuba's bloodlines emphasized intelligence and even temperament. The pairing was deliberate breeding science, attempting to combine Fair Play's competitive fire with Mahuba's calmer disposition. The second foal from this mating was the chestnut colt Mrs. Belmont would name My Man O' War in honor of her husband, who'd enlisted in the army at age 65 to serve in France during World War I. The young colt showed promise from birth, but was difficult to handle. He inherited some of Hastings' bad temper, fighting handlitters during early training, refusing to cooperate with simple tasks. Breaking him to saddle was a struggle. Grooms who worked with him noted his high-strung personality, his impatience with confinement, his desire to dominate every situation. But they also noticed something else. When turned loose to gallop, the colt moved with power and grace that suggested extraordinary ability. In summer 1918, with World War I still raging and Belmont serving overseas, his wife made the decision to sell their entire 1917 yearling crop at the prestigious Saratoga yearling sale. Man o' War was offered as hip number 21. Bidding opened at $1,000. Several buyers showed interest early, pushing the price to $4,500. Then Samuel D. Riddle entered the bidding on advice from his trainer, Louis Fustel, who'd trained both Fair Play and Mahuba and recognized quality breeding. Riddle's final bid was $5,000, roughly $105,000 in modern currency, winning the auction. The underbidder was Robert L. Geary, Sr., who reportedly told his wife afterward, $4,500 is enough to spend for any yearling. That comment would haunt Geary for decades as Man o' War became legendary. 2 years later, in 1920, Riddle would decline an offer of $400,000 for the horse, 80 times what he'd paid. Man o' War was shipped to Glen Riddle Farm in Maryland, where trainer Louis Fustel supervised his development. Fustel had trained Man o' War's sire and dam, understanding the bloodlines intimately. He knew Fair Play's mean temperament and Mahuban's nervousness. He approached the young colt carefully, building trust through patience rather than forcing compliance. The colt grew rapidly through late 1918 and early 1919. By spring 1919, he stood over 16 hands high and weighed nearly 1,000 pounds, massive for a 2-year-old. His coat was brilliant chestnut red, with a white star and stripe on his forehead. Grooms started calling him Big Red, a nickname that would stick for life. His conformation was nearly perfect: prominent withers, powerful hindquarters, a deep chest, strong legs with excellent bone.
His only flaw was a slightly dipped back that would become more pronounced with age. When Man o' War was sent to Belmont Park for his racing debut in June 1919, Riddle made an unusual decision. He assigned a retired bay hunter named Major Treat to accompany Man o' War everywhere. Major Treat became Man o' War's constant companion, traveling with him to every racetrack, staying in adjacent stalls, calming the high-strung thoroughbred. The relationship between the retired hunter and the champion racehorse became legendary, with Man o' War becoming visibly agitated if separated from Major Treat. Man o' War's first race was June 6, 1919, at Belmont Park, a 5-furlong maiden race for 2-year-olds. Jockey Johnny Loftus, one of America's best riders, was aboard. The colt broke alertly, took the lead immediately, and won by 6 lengths while barely trying. Loftus later said he'd crossed the finish line at a canter, Man o' War so full of run that he could have won by 20 lengths if asked. Spectators who watched the race were stunned. One reportedly asked a groom afterward, "Who's he by?" The groom's response became part of racing folklore. "He's by hisself, and there ain't nobody gonna get near him." The prediction proved accurate. Man o' War wouldn't run in cheap claiming races or allowance races. Riddle declared his colt would compete only in expensive stakes races against the best 2-year-olds in America. It was an audacious strategy. Most owners protected young horses, building confidence with easier competition before testing them in stakes. Riddle went straight to the top. Man o' War's second start came 3 weeks later in the Keene Memorial Stakes at Belmont, another 5-furlong sprint. He won by 3 lengths, again looking like he could have won by more. Then came the Hudson Stakes at Aqueduct, where he won by 6 lengths. Then the Youthful Stakes at Jamaica, winning by 2 lengths despite carrying 130 pounds, extraordinary weight for a 2-year-old. Man of War was carrying more weight than most 3-year-olds and still winning with ease. By late July 1919, Man of War had won his first 6 races, often by wide margins, always as the betting favorite. Racing fans were beginning to realize this wasn't just another good 2-year-old. This was something special, a colt who made racing look effortless. His average winning margin through 6 races was over 5 lengths. He never looked fully extended. Loftus reported that holding Man of War back was harder than urging him forward. The colt wanted to run all out every race. Then came Saratoga and the Sanford Memorial Stakes on August 13, 1919. The race would become the most controversial defeat in thoroughbred racing history. The Sanford Memorial was 6 furlongs, slightly longer than Man of War's previous races. The field included 7 horses, most notably a colt named Upset, trained by James Rowe and owned by Harry Payne Whitney. Upset had decent form, but was considered no match for Man of War, who entered as the prohibitive 1-2 favorite, despite carrying 130 pounds to Upset's 115 pounds, a 15-pound concession. The start was chaotic. The starter at Saratoga that day was a 70-year-old man named Charles Pettingill, using the old-fashioned barrier start system rather than modern starting gates. Pettingill dropped the barrier 5 times prematurely as horses wheeled, turned sideways, or broke before he signaled. Each time he had to recall the field and reset. Man of War, high-strung and impatient, became increasingly agitated with each false start. On what became the 6th attempt, Pettingill dropped the barrier when Man of War was facing nearly sideways, his head turned toward the outside rail. Loftus later claimed he was trying to calm Man of War when the start happened, catching him completely unprepared. By the time Loftus got Man of War straightened and running, the field had a 10-length lead. Man of War was dead last. But Man of War's brilliance began showing immediately. He started passing horses rapidly, moving from last to 4th within the first 2 furlongs. By the far turn, he'd moved to 2nd, chasing Upset and Golden Broom, who were running together on the rail. Loftus tried to find racing room between the 2 leaders or outside them, but Golden Broom's jockey Willie Knapp saw Man of War coming and deliberately moved out, blocking any path around. Man of War was trapped behind the leaders with nowhere to go. Only in deep stretch did an opening appear. Loftus finally got Man of War clear, and the big colt exploded forward, closing on Upset with every stride. But the gap at the start and the blocked path on the turn had cost too much ground. Man of War closed to within a half length of Upset at the wire, but ran out racetrack. Upset won by half a length, in what remains one of racing's most controversial finishes. The Saratoga crowd of 12,000 fans was stunned. Many had bet heavily on the unbeatable Man of War at 1-2 odds. Others who'd witnessed the chaotic start and blocked running path believed Man of War had been deliberately interfered with. Rumors swirled immediately that the race had been fixed, that Willie Knapp aboard Golden Broom had been paid to block Man of War, that even starter Pettingill might have been complicit in the bad start. Johnny Loftus never publicly claimed interference or foul play, but he told friends privately that Golden Broom's move blocking him was deliberate. Upset's jockey Willie Knapp admitted decades later in retirement that the race haunted him. He said in an interview years later, "The same moment I gunned Upset with my bat and galloped to the top in a pair of jumps. Then Man of War had to come out around the 2 of us, and it cost him all of 2 lengths. From there to the finish he was charging like a jet plane, but Upset had just enough left to push his head down in front. Sure, I won the race all right. It was the greatest thrill of my life. But looking back at it now, there's sure one horse which should have retired undefeated. Never was a colt like him. He could do anything and do it better than any horse that ever lived. If I'd moved over just an eyelash that day at Saratoga, he'd have beat me from here to Jalopy. Sometimes I'm sorry I didn't do it. Despite the loss, Man of War was named American Champion 2-year-old Colt of 1919. Handicappers rated him 16 pounds superior to the second-best 2-year-old. But the defeat had consequences. Johnny Loftus applied to the Jockey Club for license renewal for the 1920 season and was denied without explanation. Rumors suggested Jockey Club officials believed Loftus either deliberately lost the Sanford or had mishandled Man of War so badly that he was unfit to ride champions. Loftus never rode Man of War again. For the final 3 races of his 2-year-old season, Man of War was ridden by different jockeys while Riddle and Fustel searched for Loftus's replacement. Man of War won the Remsen Stakes at Aqueduct, then the Richmond Stakes at Saratoga, but the Extra Stakes at Jamaica, winning by 5 lengths, his 7th and last win of the season.
Grand Union Horse Stakes by 2 lengths, the Hopeful Stakes by 5 lengths, and the Futurity Stakes at Belmont by 1.5 lengths. His 2-year-old record was 9 wins in 10 starts, with earnings of $82,275, enormous money for 1919. More impressively, he'd carried 130 pounds in 6 races, weight few 2-year-olds in history had ever been asked to carry. Over winter 1919-1920, Man o' War grew substantially. By spring 1920, he stood 16.2½ hands high and weighed approximately 1,150 pounds with a 72-inch girth. He'd become a physical specimen unlike anything American racing had seen. His new jockey was Clarence Cummer, a skilled rider who'd replaced Loftus for Man o' War's entire 3-year-old campaign. Samuel Riddle made a controversial decision in early 1920. Man o' War would not run in the Kentucky Derby. Riddle's reasoning was multifaceted. First, he disliked racing in what he called the West, which for him included Kentucky. Riddle was an Eastern establishment horseman who preferred racing at Belmont, Aqueduct, and Saratoga, where high society gathered. Second, he believed the Derby came too early in the year, run in early May before 3-year-olds had fully matured. Third, the Derby distance of 1.25 miles seemed demanding for a horse who'd excel at shorter distances. The decision denied Man o' War a chance at what would later be called the Triple Crown. Sir Barton had won the Kentucky Derby, Preakness Stakes, and Belmont Stakes in 1919, but the achievement wasn't called the Triple Crown until Gallant Fox accomplished it in 1930 with extensive media attention. Still, skipping the Derby was controversial. Critics argued Riddle was protecting Man o' War's undefeated record by avoiding strong competition. Man o' War made his 3-year-old debut May 18, 1920, in the Preakness Stakes at Pimlico in Baltimore, then run at a distance of 1.125 miles. Only 7 horses entered to face him. Several owners had scratched their entries when learning Man o' War was running. The race was never competitive. Man o' War took the lead and won by 1.5 lengths over Upset. Yes, the same Upset who'd beaten him at Saratoga the previous year. This time, with a fair start and clear running, Man o' War defeated Upset easily. The time was 1 minute, 51 3/5 seconds, a new stakes record. 3 weeks later came the Withers Stakes at Belmont, where Man o' War carried 135 pounds and won by 2 lengths. Then the Belmont Stakes on June 12th, run at 1 mile and 3/8, where Man o' War faced just one opponent, a horse named Donnacona. Riddle was so confident that he instructed Cummer not to push Man o' War, just to win comfortably. The result was a 20-length demolition, with Man o' War setting a world record time of 2 minutes, 14 1/5 seconds that would stand for decades. The Belmont victory showcased Man o' War's devastating combination of speed and stamina. At 1 mile and 3/8, the race tested whether the big colt could maintain his speed over distance. He'd won by 20 lengths while being held back, demonstrating that distance was no barrier to his dominance. Had Comer asked him for full effort, the margin might have been 40 lengths. Through June and July 1920, Man O' War continued his rampage through American racing. He won the Stuyvesant Handicap at Aqueduct by 8 lengths. He won the Dwyer Stakes at Aqueduct by 7 lengths after engaging in the race's only competitive moment. A Whitney stable colt named John P. Greer challenged Man O' War at the top of the stretch, pulling even briefly. Comer, shocked that another horse had dared challenge his mount, used his whip for the first time in Man O' War's career. The response was immediate. Man O' War pulled away and won by 1.5 lengths. The Dwyer Stakes became significant because it was the only race where Man O' War appeared vulnerable, even momentarily. John P. Greer had run the race of his life, forcing Man O' War to try harder than he had since Saratoga. The performance reminded fans that while Man O' War was dominant, he wasn't supernatural. He could be pushed, challenged, made to work. The fact that he'd responded when challenged only enhanced his reputation. By August 1920, Man O' War's fame had transcended racing. Newspapers across America covered his races on front pages. Newsreel cameras filmed him training. Fans flocked to racetracks in record numbers just to see him, even when he was only working out. At Saratoga, where he returned in August for the first time since his defeat the previous year, crowds of 15,000 gathered just to watch morning training sessions. The attention created security concerns. Fans mobbed Man O' War, trying to touch him, pull hairs from his mane and tail as souvenirs. Riddle hired guards to protect the horse. There were even alleged assassination attempts, anonymous threats suggesting people would harm or kill Man O' War. Whether these threats were serious or pranks remains unclear, but Riddle took them seriously enough to station guards outside Man O' War's stall 24 days a week. Man O' War won the Miller Stakes at Saratoga by 4 lengths, then prepared for the Travers Stakes, the Midsummer Championship for 3-year-olds. Despite being one of Saratoga's most prestigious races, only 3 other horses besides Man O' War entered. The others were basically sacrificial lambs hoping for place money behind the inevitable winner. Man O' War won by 10 lengths, barely trying. After the Travers, Man O' War shipped to Belmont for the Lawrence Realization Stakes, run at 1 mile and 5/8, the longest race he'd face all year. Only one horse, a colt named Hoodwink, entered against him. What happened in that race entered racing legend. Man O' War won by an estimated 100 lengths. The margin was so large that official timers couldn't accurately measure it. Hoodwink's jockey reportedly pulled up his mount, giving up mid-race because continuing seemed pointless. The performance was absurd, a display of dominance so complete it bordered on cruel. The Lawrence Realization demonstrated something important. Man O' War was getting stronger as the season progressed rather than tiring. Most 3-year-olds showed fatigue by September after 7 months of racing. Man O' War was running better in September than he had in May. The conditioning program designed by Fostel and Riddle had created an athlete whose stamina exceeded any thoroughbred anyone had seen. On September 18, 1920, Man O' War won the Miller Stakes by 15 lengths. Only one horse had entered against him. 3 days later, he won the Potomac Handicap at Havre de Grace in Maryland by 6 lengths under 138 pounds, the highest weight any
3-year-old had carried in decades. The racing season was nearly over. Man O' War had gone 11 for 11 as a 3-year-old. His career record was 20 wins and 21 starts. The only remaining question was what came next. That question was answered when representatives from Canadian horseman J.K.L. Ross approached Riddle with a proposal. Ross owned Sir Barton, who'd won what would later be known as the Triple Crown in 1919. Sir Barton was now 4 years old, still racing, still competitive. Ross challenged Riddle to a match race, Man O' War versus Sir Barton, 3-year-old American champion against 4-year-old Canadian champion, to determine North America's best horse. The purse would be $75,000, winner take all, enormous money for 1920. Riddle accepted. The match race was scheduled for October 12, 1920, at Kenilworth Park in Windsor, Ontario, just across the Detroit River from Michigan. The distance would be 1.25 miles. Under weight for age conditions, Sir Barton as a 4-year-old would carry 126 pounds, while 3-year-old Man o' War would carry 120 pounds, a 6-pound concession to the younger horse. The build-up was unprecedented. Newspapers across North America covered the race extensively. Special trains were chartered from New York, Chicago, Toronto, bringing racing fans to Windsor. The small track, which normally held maybe 10,000 people, was overwhelmed by demand. Eventually, 30,000 fans packed into Kenilworth, with thousands more standing outside unable to get in. The gate receipts set records. It was the biggest horse race in North American history to that point. Man o' War was installed as the overwhelming favorite at odds of 1 to 20, meaning a bettor had to risk $20 to win $1. Sir Barton was the underdog at 11 to 20. The odds reflected reality. Man o' War had demolished every horse he'd faced for 11 straight races, while Sir Barton, though excellent, had lost 3 of his 28 career starts and hadn't shown the same dominance. The race itself was anticlimactic. Sir Barton broke alertly and grabbed an early lead, trying to use his experience and tactical speed. For the first quarter mile, Sir Barton led by 2 lengths. Then Coomer let Man o' War loose. The big chestnut colt accelerated on the backstretch, passed Sir Barton effortlessly, and opened up a commanding lead. By the top of the stretch, Man o' War was 5 lengths ahead. At the finish, the margin was 7 lengths. The track record for 1 1/4 miles had been 2 minutes, 3 2/5 seconds. Man o' War ran it in 2 minutes, 3 seconds flat, lowering the record by 6 seconds, while Coomer sat still throughout, never asking for full effort. The performance was the perfect ending to Man o' War's career. Samuel Riddle announced retirement immediately. The decision was controversial. Many wanted to see Man o' War race as a 4-year-old, facing older handicap horses, perhaps shipping to England for the Ascot Gold Cup. But Riddle had good reasons to retire the horse. Under handicap racing rules that dominated the era, better horses carried more weight to equalize competition. Man o' War as a 3-year-old had already carried up to 138 pounds. As a 4-year-old, handicappers would start him at 140 pounds minimum, increasing weight each time he won. Eventually, the weight would become unbearable even for Man o' War's strength. As one observer noted, the one certain thing about racing is that weight will eventually stop the greatest of racers and bring them to equal terms with horses of much less quality. Riddle chose to retire Man o' War undefeated as a 3-year-old, rather than risk weight defeating him as a 4-year-old. Man o' War's final statistics were extraordinary. He'd won 20 of 21 career starts, with earnings of $249,465, enormous for the era. He'd set 5 American track records, 2 world records, and broken numerous stakes records. His average margin of victory was over 9 lengths. He'd been odds-on favorite in all 21 starts, with odds reaching 1 to 100 3 times. He'd carried 130 pounds or more in 9 races, including 138 pounds as a 3-year-old, weight that would challenge most horses at any age. Man o' War retired to stud at Faraway Farm near Lexington, Kentucky, originally at Elizabeth Dangerfield's Hinata Farm before moving to Riddle's own facility. His stud fee was $5,000, the same amount Riddle had paid for him as a yearling. The fee was astronomical for 1920, but demand was so high that Riddle could have charged more. Riddle restricted breeding rights carefully, allowing relatively few outside mares to visit Man o' War, preferring to breed the stallion to his own mares. Despite limited opportunities, Man o' War sired 64 stakes winners from just 379 named foals, an exceptional ratio. His most famous offspring was War Admiral, who won the 1937 Triple Crown and became a champion sire himself. Other notable progeny included Crusader, American Flag, Edith Cavell, Bateau, Scapa Flow, and Florence Nightingale. Through his daughters particularly, Man o' War's bloodline dominated American thoroughbred breeding. By the 1940s, virtually every champion in America traced lineage to Man o' War either through direct male line or through his daughters. At Faraway Farm, Man o' War became a tourist attraction. Between 1921 and 1947, more people visited Faraway Farm to see Man o' War than visited Kentucky's second biggest tourist attraction, Mammoth Cave. Riddle welcomed visitors, understanding Man o' War's cultural significance. The big chestnut stallion, now referred to universally as Big Red, lived in comfortable retirement with his constant companion Major Treat still in the adjacent stall. Will Harbit, a black groom at Faraway Farm, became Man-O-War's primary caretaker and eventually his most famous advocate. Harbit gave tours of the farm, showing visitors the great stallion, telling stories about his racing career. Harbit's description of Man-O-War became legendary. "He's got everything a horse ought to have, and he's got it where a horse ought to have it. He's the mostest horse." The phrase, "the mostest horse," became synonymous with Man-O-War. In October 1947, Will Harbit died of a heart attack at age 62. He'd been Man-O-War's groom for 19 years, caring for the stallion daily, developing a bond that everyone at Faraway Farm recognized. Man-O-War seemed to mourn Harbit's death, becoming agitated when his familiar groom didn't arrive at the usual time. Less than a month later, on November 1, 1947, Man-O-War died of a heart attack at age 30. He'd been retired from breeding duties 4 years earlier after another heart attack in 1943, but had lived comfortably at Faraway Farm with excellent care. His death was front-page news across America. NBC Radio broadcast his funeral nationwide, extraordinary for a...
The funeral drew over 2,000 mourners to Faraway Farm, including many who'd never seen Man-O-War race but knew his legend. Man-O-War was buried at Faraway Farm in a massive oak casket lined with his racing colors of Riddle's Farm, black and yellow. His grave was marked by a life-size bronze statue sculpted by Herbert Hazeltine, showing Man-O-War in his prime. The statue became a pilgrimage site for racing fans. In 1977, 30 years after his death, Man-O-War's remains were moved to Kentucky Horse Park in Lexington, where they remain today beneath the iconic statue. The legacy assessment of Man-O-War has evolved over 104 years since his final race. In 1950, the Associated Press poll of sports writers voted him the greatest horse of the first half of the 20th century. In 1999, the Blood Horse magazine and ESPN both ranked him the top American racehorse of the entire 20th century, ahead of Secretariat, Citation, Seattle Slew, Count Fleet, and every other champion. Sports Illustrated ranked him second behind only Man-O-War in their century rankings, though some lists put Secretariat first, based on documented times that exceeded Man-O-War's hand-timed records. The debate over greatest racehorse ever inevitably returns to Man-O-War versus Secretariat. Secretariat's 1973 Belmont Stakes performance, winning by 31 lengths in 2 minutes 24 flat for a mile and a half, remains the single greatest race performance ever captured on film. Man-O-War's 1920 races were hand-timed with less precise methodology. Secretariat ran on modern tracks with better surfaces. Man-O-War ran on slower surfaces carrying heavy handicap weights. Comparing them definitively is impossible. But Man-O-War's cultural impact exceeded even Secretariat's. During the 1920s, the golden age of sports featuring Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey, Red Grange, Bobby Jones, Man-O-War was arguably the most famous athlete in America. Sports writer Grandland Rice, who'd covered every major athlete of the era, wrote that Man-O-War struck him as one who had a furious desire to win, comparable to Ty Cobb, Jack Dempsey, or any other great competitor Rice had witnessed. The New York Times honored Man-O-War and Babe Ruth together as outstanding athletes of 1920. Both had transformed their sports, Ruth by hitting home runs at unprecedented rates, Man-O-War by winning races at margins never seen before. The comparison was apt. Both athletes made their sports exciting for casual fans. Both created records that stood for decades. Both became cultural icons transcending sports. Man-O-War's influence on thoroughbred breeding is incalculable. Through his daughters particularly, his bloodline appears in virtually every modern thoroughbred pedigree. Seabiscuit, Secretariat, Seattle Slew, Affirmed, American Pharoah, every great American racehorse since 1947 traces lineage to Man-O-War. His genetic contribution to the breed rivals or exceeds any other stallion in history. The one loss to Upset remains controversial 104 years later.
Modern racing historians who've studied the Sanford Memorial generally conclude Man O' War was disadvantaged by the bad start and blocked running, but wasn't deliberately interfered with in a manner requiring disqualification. The controversy reflects how dominant Man O' War was. Losing even once seems so impossible that foul play must have been involved. But Upset was a quality horse who ran the race of his life, while Man O' War had everything go wrong. Sometimes that's enough. Willie Knapp, Upset's jockey, never claimed he'd been paid to block Man O' War or deliberately interfered. His post-race interview years later expressed regret for not giving Man O' War more room, suggesting he understood the controversy but insisting he'd ridden to win legitimately. Johnny Loftus never publicly accused anyone of fixing the race. The Jockey Club's refusal to renew Loftus's license remains mysterious. No official explanation was ever given. The Sanford Memorial loss, rather than diminishing Man O' War's legacy, enhanced it. The perfect horse who lost once under controversial circumstances became more compelling than an undefeated champion. The loss proved he was beatable, making his subsequent 14-race winning streak more impressive. And the loss gave him motivation. Man O' War beat Upset 6 times after the Sanford, including in the Preakness, always by comfortable margins. Samuel Riddle's decision to skip the Kentucky Derby denied Man O' War the Triple Crown, but the Triple Crown wasn't yet the mythical achievement it would become. The term wasn't coined until 1930. Sir Barton had won the 3 races in 1919 with minimal fanfare. Only after Gallant Fox won in 1930 did the Derby Preakness Belmont sweep become racing's holy grail. Had Riddle known the Triple Crown would become so significant, he might have entered Man O' War in the Derby, but in 1920, winning the Preakness and Belmont while skipping Derby seemed reasonable. Man O' War's retirement at age 3 was criticized by some who wanted to see him race longer, but Riddle's reasoning was sound. The handicap weight system would have crushed even Man O' War eventually. Better to retire undefeated as a 3-year-old than risk losing as a 4-year-old under 145 or 150 pounds. Riddle prioritized Man O' War's legacy over short-term gate receipts. The $5,000 purchase price at Saratoga remains one of racing's greatest bargains. Robert Gary, who'd stopped bidding at $4,500, lived another 30 years watching Man O' War become legendary, knowing he'd been $500 away from owning the century's greatest racehorse. The story became a cautionary tale. Sometimes the difference between greatness and regret is one more bid. Over a century after his last race, Man O' War remains the gold standard for thoroughbred excellence. When racing commentators describe a dominant performance, they reference Man O' War. When breeders discuss ideal conformation, they point to photographs of Big Red. When trainers seek to inspire young horses, they invoke Man O' War's competitive spirit. His legacy isn't just records and statistics, though those are impressive. His legacy is the standard itself. Every great horse since 1920 has been measured against Man O' War. Most fall short. When Man O' War crossed the finish line at Kenilworth Park on October 12, 1920, 7 lengths ahead of Sir Barton, having broken the track record by 6 full seconds while his jockey held him under restraint, he completed one of the greatest racing careers in history. 20 wins in 21 starts, 5 American track records, 2 world records, average victory margin over 9 lengths, never beaten when given a fair start and clear running. The big chestnut colt bought for $5,000 had become priceless, a legend whose fame would endure for over a century. Because sometimes greatness isn't about being perfect, it's about being so dominant that losing once only makes the story better. And on that October day in Windsor, Man O' War proved he was the mostest horse that ever was.